The first time I heard the bell, I was 7 years old. It was a cold autumn night, the kind where the wind howls through the trees like a mournful spirit, shaking the branches until they scrape against the window pane like skeletal fingers. I was lying in bed, wrapped in my blankets, staring at the ceiling in that space between sleep and wakefulness. The night was silent, too silent. Then, at exactly midnight, I heard it. A deep, metallic toll. The sound cut through the night air, heavy and full of weight, like it carried something ancient within its vibrations. It didn't echo like church bells should. Instead, it seemed to reverberate inside my bones, as though the sound had been struck from within me. The moment it rang, I felt a sudden, sharp chill wrap around my body, freezing me in place. My breath hitched, and for a long moment, I couldn't move. I thought it was coming from the old church at the edge of town, St. Matthias, an abandoned relic that no one visited anymore. It had been closed long before I was born, its doors sealed, its pews left to decay. And yet, its bell tower still stood tall, its iron bell rusting in the autumn rain. The sound faded, leaving behind an oppressive silence. My heart pounded against my ribs as I strained to hear anything else. Footsteps, a voice, the rustling of leaves. But there was nothing, just the wind against the glass. I stayed awake for hours, but the bell did not ring again. The next morning, I asked my parents about it over breakfast. Mom? Dad? Did you hear the bell last night? They both looked up from their plates. My mother's face paled slightly. My father exchanged a glance with her before shaking his head. What bell, sweetheart? She asked, her voice careful. The one that rang at midnight, I said. From Street Matthias. Silence. Attention settled over the table, thick and uneasy. There is no midnight bell, my father finally said, his tone firm. You must have been dreaming. I frowned. But I heard it enough, he interrupted, pushing his plate aside. The church is abandoned. The bell hasn't rung in decades. I knew he was lying. I heard it again the next night, and the night after that, and the night after that. It didn't happen every night, only sometimes, as if the bell chose when to call out. But when it did, I could feel something deep within me respond to it. Not fear, not yet, but something close. Something like recognition. As I grew older, I stopped mentioning the midnight bell. I tried asking some of my friends about it once, when I was about 10. We were riding our bikes near the church ruins after school, the old structure looming like a forgotten relic from another time. The walls were cracked, covered in moss, and the wooden doors were nailed shut with iron bars. The stained glass windows had been shattered long ago, leaving jagged holes like the empty sockets of a skull. Have you guys ever heard the bell ring at night? I asked, kicking a rock with my shoe. They all gave me confused looks. What bell? The church bell. It rings at midnight sometimes. Danny, the oldest of our group, let out a nervous laugh. Dude, that bell doesn't work. It hasn't in years. I've heard it. The laughter stopped. My friends shuffled uncomfortably. That's not funny, Jacob, said Lisa. Her voice was quieter than before. Don't joke about that. I'm not joking, I insisted. I really hear it. Lisa's face darkened. My grandpa used to say that if you hear the bell at midnight, it means someone is going to die. Goosebumps rose along my arms. That's just a story, I muttered. Is it? She asked. Then why do people disappear in this town? I didn't have an answer for that. By the time I was 15, I had learned to keep my mouth shut about the midnight bell. No one else seemed to hear it, and when I brought it up, People either changed the subject or told me I was imagining things. But I wasn't. One night, I decided to record it. I set up my phone on my nightstand, made sure it was fully charged, and hit the record button before lying down. My heart pounded as I stared at the ceiling, waiting. The hours crept by. Then, at exactly midnight, the bell tolled. Deep. Hollow. Wrong. The moment the sound filled the room, the temperature dropped. My breath turned visible, the cold wrapping around my limbs like invisible hands. I didn't move. I didn't even blink. The toll faded. But just as the last vibration died away, I heard something else. A whisper. Faint. Distant. I grabbed my phone with shaking hands and turned up the volume. My stomach twisted as the sound became clearer. A voice. A girl's voice. Help me. The words sent a shiver down my spine. My breathing grew uneven as I played the clip over and over. The whisper was real. It wasn't in my head. I couldn't sleep after that. Instead, I started searching online for missing persons cases in my town. That's when I found her. Emily Carter. She had gone missing 5 years ago. Last seen leaving St. Matthias Church after the midnight service. She was never found. Her case was still unsolved. I sat there for hours, staring at her picture. The more I looked, the more uneasy I felt, like her eyes were pleading with me through the screen. A sick realization settled in my gut. The bell hadn't been calling me. It had been calling for help. That night, I made up my mind. I was going to St. Matthias Church. I didn't know what I would find. I didn't know what I was searching for. But deep inside, I knew one thing. The bell was still ringing, and it wanted me to listen. The night after hearing the whispering voice in my recording, I barely slept. My thoughts raced with questions, each one twisting into something worse than the last. Who was the girl? Was it really Emily Carter? And most importantly, why was she asking for help? I played the recording over and over again. The single toll of the midnight bell was unmistakable, but it was the whisper that made my skin crawl. Help me. Faint. Distant. But undeniable. The next day, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. At school, people acted the same, laughing in the hallways, shuffling from class to class. But something felt off. I caught glimpses of shadows where they shouldn't be, under desks, in the reflections of glass cabinets, lurking at the edges of my vision. And then, during lunch, my phone buzzed. A new notification. I nearly dropped my sandwich when I saw it. It was from a blocked number. Unknown. Don't look into it. I blinked. Another text immediately followed. Unknown. Walk away. Before it's too late. My stomach twisted. My hands trembled as I stared at the words. Someone knew. Someone knew I had heard the bell, and they didn't want me to dig any deeper. The text wouldn't leave my mind. I showed it to my best friend, Mark, but he just shrugged. Dude, it's probably some scam or a prank, he said, shoving another chip in his mouth. But why would someone send this to me now? I pressed. Right after I recorded the bell, Mark sighed. Maybe you want to be creepy. You've been obsessed with this bell thing for years, man. Maybe your brain is messing with you. I wanted to believe that, but I knew better. I spent the rest of the day researching Emily Carter again, this time digging through old newspaper archives online. Her disappearance was strange. She had left St. Matthias Church after the midnight mass on November 3rd, 5 years ago. Several people claimed to have seen her walking home, but somewhere between the church and her house, she vanished. No witnesses, no clues, no body. It was like she had never existed. Then I noticed something weird. The local newspaper archives from that month had missing pages. Whole sections were gone, completely removed. I tried other sources. Library records, town history books. Emily Carter's name was fading, like she was being erased. But why? And by who? That night, I made a decision. If I wanted real answers, I had to find where Emily was buried. Even though she was never found, her family had placed a memorial stone for her in the old cemetery just outside town. So, at 11:30 p.m., I grabbed a flashlight, pulled on my hoodie, and made my way there. The cemetery was an ancient place, overgrown and forgotten. The graves were so old that most of the names had worn away, leaving only cracked stone and moss. Emily's memorial was near the back, a small marble slab covered in vines. But as I approached, I saw something that made my blood turn to ice. The ground in front of the stone was disturbed, like someone had dug it up. A deep gash in the dirt, the earth ripped open as if something had clawed its way out. And then I heard it, the bell, a single hollow toll, loud, deafening. I dropped my flashlight, my knees locking in place as the vibrations rippled through the cemetery. And then I saw her, standing just beyond the broken grave. Emily Carter, or what was left of her. Her face was pale and sunken, her dress torn and stained. Her arms hung limply at her sides, but her eyes were locked on me. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. She took a step forward. Her lips parted, and in a voice that was not her own, she whispered, "Run." I didn't hesitate. I turned and ran, my feet pounding against the wet grass, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The cemetery seemed endless, the rows of tombstones blurring as I sprinted toward the exit. But behind me, I heard something following, not running, gliding, a whispering, hissing sound like a presence moving just behind my back. I didn't dare turn around. I reached the gate and slammed through it, nearly tripping over my own feet as I stumbled onto the main road. The second I crossed the threshold, the air went still. No more whispers, no more movement. I spun around, gasping. The cemetery was silent, empty. Emily was gone. I stood there for a long time, my heart hammering in my chest, before I finally forced myself to go home. But the second I stepped inside, my phone buzzed. A new message. Unknown. Now you've done it. A second text followed. Unknown. Midnight is coming. And then the bell tolled again. A single hollow bong that rattled through my skull. This time, I knew it wasn't just coming from the church. It was coming from inside the house. I stood frozen in my bedroom, my hands gripping the edges of my desk, my breath caught in my throat. The bell had rung again, but this time, it was inside my house. A deep, reverberating bong, shaking the air, rattling my windows. Then silence. The kind of silence that makes your skin prickle, the kind where you can hear your own heartbeat. My phone vibrated again. Another text from the unknown number. Unknown. It won't stop now. A shiver ran down my spine. I didn't know if I was breathing or suffocating. My body felt weightless, my limbs numb. I stared at my phone, hoping it was all a sick joke. But then a sound, a soft, dragging noise, coming from just outside my room. My head snapped toward the door, my breath catching in my throat. Someone was outside, or something. Slow, unsteady, a shuffle. The floorboards creaked. I grabbed my phone, barely daring to step forward. I reached for the door handle, my fingers trembling. And then knock, knock, knock. A sharp, deliberate knocking. I nearly collapsed. My entire body seized up. Who was there? Or worse, what was there? I pressed my ear against the door. Silence. I slowly reached for the handle, my palms slick with sweat. Then knock. 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 Harder this time. I stumbled back, my heart hammering. Something wasn't right. The way it knocked. It wasn't normal. The pattern was too perfect, too rhythmic, like a clock, like the toll of a bell. Knock, knock, knock. I backed away, my hands shaking. Then my phone buzzed. A new message. Unknown. Do not open the door. My blood turned to ice. I stared at the screen, my mind racing. Do not open the door. I swallowed hard, backing away further. And then, slowly, the doorknob began to turn. A quiet, deliberate click as it twisted. Not fast, not frantic, calm, controlled, like whoever or whatever was outside knew I was watching. I scrambled backward, slamming against the far wall. The knob twisted all the way, but the door didn't open. It just stayed there, waiting. I held my breath. Minutes passed, maybe seconds. It felt like an eternity. Then the knob slowly turned back into place, and the presence outside left. I didn't move for what felt like hours. Only after I was sure, absolutely sure, that it was gone did I finally dare to step forward. I pressed my palm against the door. Cold, ice cold, as if whatever had been on the other side had sucked the warmth from the air. I didn't sleep that night. I had to get answers. This wasn't just about Emily Carter anymore. Something was following me, something that shouldn't exist. The only person I could think of who might know anything was Father Thomas, the old priest at St. Matthias Church, the place where the midnight bell rang. So, the next morning, I skipped school and headed straight there. The church was empty, the massive wooden doors creaking as I stepped inside. The air was thick, the scent of old wood and candle wax clinging to my lungs. Father Thomas was in the front pew, his head bowed in silent prayer. I hesitated, then stepped forward. Father. He looked up slowly, his wrinkled face pale and drawn. When he saw me, something flickered in his tired eyes. You heard it, didn't you? I nearly stumbled back. He knew. He knew about the bell. I swallowed hard. Yes. His expression darkened. He looked around, as if making sure no one else was listening, then motioned for me to sit. I did. Then, in a low voice, he said, You need to leave town. Tonight. His words sent a chill down my spine. What? I asked. Father Thomas exhaled deeply. He looked tired, exhausted even, like he had carried a heavy burden for far too long. The midnight bell is not of God, he said. It is a relic of something ancient, something that should have been forgotten. I shivered. But why me? Why now? His jaw tightened. Because you listened. I felt my stomach drop. What does that mean? Father Thomas looked me straight in the eyes. The bell does not ring for everyone, he said. It chooses. It waits. And when it calls, it means something is about to happen. I felt sick. What kind of something? He hesitated. Then he whispered for words that made my blood turn to ice. You are being marked. The room seemed colder, the shadows longer. Marked for what? I whispered. Father Thomas swallowed hard. Once you hear the bell, it follows you. The sound will grow closer. The knocking will return. And when the 12th toll comes, his face was grave. It will take you. My heart pounded. I opened my mouth, but before I could speak, boom, a deep, reverberating chime. Loud, deafening. It shook the church. The pews rattled. The candles flickered violently. My head snapped toward the bell tower. The massive, rusted bell was moving, swinging back and forth, ringing, even though no one was pulling the rope. I looked at Father Thomas, my breath ragged. His face had drained of all color. "It's too late," he whispered. "The 11th toll has begun." I felt something behind me, a cold breath on the back of my neck. Slow, hissing. I didn't want to turn around. I didn't want to see what was standing there. But I could feel it, and it was waiting. Father Thomas's words echoed in my mind like the fading chime of a bell. The 11th toll has begun. I could still feel it behind me. Something cold, something watching. The air in the church was heavy, thick like wet cement. My breath came in short, sharp gasps. I didn't dare move. Then the bell rang again. Boom. It shook the rafters, the vibrations rolling through the wooden floor like a pulse from something alive. A pressure built in my skull, as if the sound was drilling into my bones. Father Thomas stumbled backward, his hands gripping the edge of the pew. His eyes were fixed behind me, wide, horrified. He saw it. I didn't want to turn. I didn't want to see what had finally come for me. But some unnatural force pulled at me. A pressure, a command. Look, I couldn't fight it. Slowly, my body turned on its own, and I saw it. A figure stood in the aisle. Tall, too tall. Its head nearly brushed the wooden beams of the ceiling. It was shrouded in something black. Not cloth, not shadow, something worse, like the absence of light itself, a void that seemed to swallow everything around it. In its face it had none. Where I should have been, there were only 2 deep holes. Not empty, not blank, moving, shifting. Inside them, I saw things I wasn't supposed to see. Dark figures moving through fog. A pale hand rising from black water. A doorway leading into nothingness. It wasn't just looking at me. It was showing me something. A glimpse of where it wanted to take me. Where the 12th toll would lead. My body locked up. I couldn't run. Couldn't move. Then, the figure did something that nearly stopped my heart. It reached for me. A long, bony hand extended from the shadows, its fingers too many. Stretching, curling, reaching. I tried to scream. Nothing came out. A sudden roar of sound shattered the silence. Father Thomas shouting in Latin. He lifted his cross, his voice filled with something I hadn't expected, desperation. The figure jerked back, not in fear, not in pain, but in annoyance, like a wolf being shooed away from prey it knew it could come back for. And then it was gone, vanished. The church went silent. No bell, no presence, just Father Thomas, his breath ragged, his hand clutching his cross so tightly his knuckles had turned white. But I could still feel it, lingering, waiting. Father Thomas wasted no time. "We don't have much of it left," he said, pulling me toward the back of the church. I was still shaking, my legs barely moving. What was that?" I stammered. The priest didn't answer. Not right away. He led me through a narrow hallway, into a dusty old library filled with ancient books and fading papers. He rummaged through a locked cabinet, his hands trembling as he pulled out something wrapped in cloth. A journal. He placed it on the table, opening it to a page covered in frantic, scribbled handwriting. And then he whispered, "You are not the first." My blood ran cold. I leaned over the pages. The words were old, dated 1897. They spoke of a young man who had also heard the bell. He had described the same things. The knocking, the text messages, except back then, it had been letters appearing out of nowhere. The presence. The figure. He had written about hearing the 11th toll. I swallowed. What happened to him? Father Thomas turned the page. The final entry was unfinished. The last thing he had written, "It is here. I hear the 12th. It ended there." I stared at the empty space, the unfinished sentence like a black hole. The priest's voice was grim. No one who hears the 12th toll has ever been seen again. I sat there in stunned silence. I had one toll left, one more bell, and I would be gone. My breath came faster, my chest tightening. "There has to be a way," I said, my voice cracking. "A way to stop it." Father Thomas didn't answer right away. Then, slowly, he said, "There is one thing." I leaned forward, desperate. "What?" He hesitated. Then, "You must destroy the bell tower." I felt like I had misheard. "Destroy it?" Father Thomas nodded, his expression grave. "The bell is ancient. It was never meant to ring in this world. It is a doorway, a beacon." He closed the journal with a heavy sigh. "If it is destroyed before the 12th toll, you might break the cycle." "Might." I swallowed. "And if I don't?" The priest's eyes darkened. "Then, when midnight comes," his voice dropped to a whisper, "it will take you." I shuddered. The weight of those words settled over me like a suffocating blanket. I had to make a choice. Destroy the bell tower, or accept my fate. I didn't hesitate. I was going to end this. No more waiting. No more running. Tonight, before midnight, I would climb that tower and burn it to the ground. The wind howled as I stood at the base of the bell tower. The ancient structure loomed above me, its jagged silhouette etched against the night sky like the ribs of some long-dead beast. The weight of Father Thomas's words still pressed against my chest. Destroy the bell before the 12th toll, or it will take you. My fingers tightened around the crowbar I had taken from the church's tool shed. I had no plan, no guarantees. Only one desperate chance to break this nightmare. I inhaled sharply, my breath visible in the freezing night air, and took my first step inside. The wooden stairs groaned under my weight as I ascended. The air grew colder with every step, thick with the scent of dust, mildew, and something rotten. Somewhere above me, the bell sat waiting. It had stood in this tower for centuries. How many others had heard its call? How many had climbed these very steps, desperate to stop what was coming, only to fail? I shoved the thought aside. I couldn't fail. I wouldn't. But as I reached the middle of the tower, something changed. The air shifted. The silence deepened. And then a whisper, right behind me. "You are too late." My blood ran ice cold. Slowly, heart pounding, I turned my head. Nothing. Just the empty stairwell behind me. I forced myself to keep moving. I had to reach the top. I had to end this. When I reached the belfry, the sight of the bell nearly knocked the breath out of me. It was massive, hanging in the center of the tower like an executioner's axe. Its surface was blackened with age, but something dripped from the edges, thick, dark liquid. I knew what it was. Blood. The moment my eyes locked onto it, the entire tower trembled. The ropes beside me suddenly snapped tight, as if unseen hands had seized them. The shadows around me shifted. Something was here, watching, waiting. I gritted my teeth and raised the crowbar. If I could break the supports, the bell would collapse. I took my first swing, boom. The sound slammed into me like a tidal wave. I staggered back, hands flying to my ears as a scream tore through my skull. But it wasn't my scream. It was dozens of voices. trapped souls, howling from inside the bell. And then the shadows moved. I barely had time to react before something grabbed me. A freezing hand locked around my throat, lifting me off the ground. I gasped, struggling, my legs kicking uselessly. And then I saw it, the figure from a church. It had followed me. It was here, but this time it had a face. And it was mine. A perfect, rotting copy of me. Its lips curled into a horrific smile. I choked, my vision swimming as the grip on my throat tightened. Then it spoke. "Your turn." My mind snapped. With all the strength I had left, I swung the crowbar. The metal collided with the figure's face. There was no scream, only a sickening crunch. The grip loosened, and I crashed to the wooden planks, coughing. I didn't have time to think. Didn't have time to feel fear. I scrambled to my feet, raised the crowbar again, and swung it into the supports. Once, twice. The wood splintered. The bell lurched. And then it fell. The massive bell plunged through the tower, crashing through each level with an ear-splitting roar. The walls buckled. Dust and debris filled the air. I ran. I didn't stop. Didn't look back. I barely made it outside before the entire tower collapsed. A thunderous explosion of wood and stone shook the ground, sending a shock wave through the trees. Then silence. No more whispers. No more tolling. Just the distant sound of burning wood and the first light of dawn creeping over the horizon. Father Thomas found me an hour later, staring at the smoking remains of the bell tower. His face was unreadable, but when he finally spoke, his voice was quiet. "It's over." I wanted to believe him. I really did. But as I stood there, I couldn't shake one final, terrifying thought. The bell was gone. The tower was destroyed. But as the wind shifted, I swore I still heard something. A sound so faint, so distant, I almost convinced myself I had imagined it. A single, echoing toll. Boom. And I knew it was not over.